Hey guys, James here and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, this channel is all about sharing my lifelong love of cars with you guys. Today, I want to take you guys on a tour of Hyundai's press photos of the Ioniq 5. We'll talk about things like why does the Ioniq 5 look smaller than it actually is? What does the Ioniq 5 have to do with the mid-engine mommy-mobile minivans of the mid-80s? And ultimately, what is the target audience that Hyundai is going for with the Ioniq 5? Let's start by talking about the name Ioniq. Now, the name Ioniq, I-O-N-I-Q, comes from a blend of the word ion and unique. And prior to the Ioniq 5, Hyundai used the name Ioniq for some hatchbacks that were, in fact, electrified. There was a hybrid, a plug-in hybrid, and an electric version, but they weren't particularly unique. Now, though, the new Ioniq 5 actually earns the unique part of its name. I mean, just look at this thing. There's nothing like it on the road. Let's start by taking a look at the exterior design. Now, a lot of the press photos feature this car in what's called gravity gold, which is kind of a semi-matte color. You actually have to take care of it differently than you would a normal car. As is usual for a lot of press photos or media photos, Hyundai has really boosted up the contrast in these photos. And so in real life, if you see, videos on YouTube from like non-Hyundai people, then you'll actually see that it's not quite as shiny as this. It's a little bit more muted, but it's a very cool color nonetheless. I think the Ioniq 5 design succeeds because not only does it have classic, well-done proportions, but also the details are really cool as well. I mean, this Zorro-style slash in the door panel looks so much better in here than it does in the Elantra, which looks like it just got T-boned. There's a very high density of details on this car, little creases and lines, but I think it's done very tastefully, and these details don't interrupt the overall shape of the vehicle, which I think is very classic and very nice. Now here's a picture of the front end, and you can see in the picture that it looks very wide, and in real life I think it has that presence, it has that substantial kind of look to it. What's actually really funny about this front end is that in many ways it actually looks a lot like my Camaro, and what do I mean by that? Well, you've got this kind of hooded thing here. Inside there you have these dual element DRLs that are roughly U-shaped on both sides, and then of course the headlights and the high beams are embedded into there. Obviously the effect is really quite different, mostly because these DRLs are very rectangular. Now let's take a look at the DRLs a little more up close, and you can see from this picture that everything has this very gridded, pixelated pattern, and this motif of pixelation is going to show up everywhere in the Ioniq. It's not just futuristic, but it's like futuristic pixelated, which is interesting, right? So I'll explain why I think they did that in a bit. Now in this photo, the back end of the Ioniq looks really cool too. But having seen the Ioniq in real life, I think that's probably the weakest aspect of the exterior design. If you see an Ioniq 5 out on the road, you'll actually notice that the back end looks a little bit almost like constricted or pinched in a way that doesn't look that flattering. You can see that it looks a little dowdy, it looks a little bit hunchbacky. I don't know, to my eyes, it looks kind of like a full diaper. I don't know how else to describe it. Anyway, not the prettiest design in the back, but I do love the details on the back end, so let's talk about those. This low resolution kind of pixelated look is so cool to me. It's a lot like Tamagotchi or other similar games and digital displays of the early 90s. Here's another view of the taillight along with the Ioniq 5 badge. I think the font looks really awesome. Now, the odd one out here is the Hyundai badge. I really think that Hyundai's logo is due for a redesign, kind of like how Kia has recently updated its logo to be a lot more edgy. I don't know about you guys, but somewhere deep in my brain, I still associate this badge with like a 2005 Sonata. A lot of journalists and automotive YouTubers have observed that the Ioniq 5 is actually a lot bigger than it looks, or it looks smaller than it actually is. And I think the side profile is the key to why that's the case. And it all comes down to proportions. The Ioniq 5 is just over 182 inches long, which is just about an inch longer than a Toyota RAV4. But the wheelbase is 118 inches, and for context, the RAV4 has a wheelbase of 106. In other words, a more normally proportioned SUV, the RAV4, is only 1 inch shorter than the Ioniq 5, but the wheelbase is a foot smaller than the Ioniq 5 wheelbase. And even when you compare the Ioniq 5 to its mechanical sibling, which is the Kia EV6, the Ioniq 5 is actually a little bit shorter than the EV6, but the EV6 has the shorter wheelbase by 4 inches. So the Ioniq 5 has this very strange proportion where the wheelbase is actually very large, very long compared to the overall length of the vehicle. And that type of proportion is more typical of smaller vehicles. For example, think about a Mini Cooper, right? It's got a very short front overhang, very short rear overhang. And that's kind of what the Ioniq 5 has. I think these proportions also give the Ioniq 5 a more edgy, more cool look. And really, it creates a lot of practicality. Later on, when we look at the interior, we'll see just how much space that big old wheelbase gives the Ioniq 5. I'm not totally sure what Hyundai is trying to tell us here, but I'm guessing it has something to do with the idea that in the case that, climate change does go too far and it's irreversible and the polar ice caps are all melted, sea levels are way up, the Ioniq 5 is still going to work because apparently it floats. Now check this out. This, my friends, is a crazy cool wheel design that, again, is straight out of the early 90s. This wheel design is what you get when you get the limited trim level, which is the top one, with all-wheel drive. And this is a 20-inch wheel. Sadly, the vast majority of Ioniq 5s will not have this incredible wheel design, but instead will have the 19-inch design, which looks way worse. And check out this angle, which looks amazing, right? I love this black painted section, which ensures that the wheels don't look overly busy and overly classic, but that they have a certain modern feel to them, because we mostly see these like veins out here on the edge. If you take a look at these lines on the wheel arch, you'll see that it suggests forward motion, right? Those lines are swept back because the car is moving forward. Unfortunately, both sides of the Ioniq are not going to look the same. On the left side of the vehicle, you'll see that these bright areas on the wheel match the wheel arch, whereas on the right side of the car, they are actually opposed. Now, of course, I understand why they did it, right? They want the wheels to be interchangeable, and yes, the left and right side of the car will look a tiny bit different, and nobody but crazy people like me will notice. But now you will too. Now, this picture shows the solar roof that you can get, and you might be thinking, how much range can this thing possibly produce? Well, as it turns out, Hyundai tells us that in a sunny climate, each year you can get up to about 2,000 kilometers or about 1,200 miles of extra range from this solar roof. And without this solar roof, you can get a sunroof that has a shade that opens like Moses parting the Red Sea. It's like, doesn't actually make that sound. Hyundai says that you get up to 303 miles of range with the rear-wheel drive, and most of the all-wheel drive models will get 269 miles of range, and it'll be a little bit less if you get those like super cool 20-inch wheels, because those are less aerodynamic, more rolling resistance, and so on. To put that into perspective, the Ioniq 5 maxes out at 303 miles of range, and the Model Y from Tesla starts at 303 miles and goes up from there. But we do know that Tesla tends to be a little bit optimistic in their quoted range figures, unlike some of the more traditional OEMs. And so there may actually be more overlap in the ranges than the numbers would actually indicate. The Ioniq 5 is one of the most road trip worthy EVs out there. I mean, it charges from 10 to 80% in as little as 18 minutes. And honestly, the limitation is going to be finding a station that can provide the full blast of electricity to charge your Ioniq 5 up at that rate. But check out these details. The charging indicator LEDs are also pixelated. Even the close button, the charging door close button, it's also a rectangle, and it's the same size as these. I love the evidence of attention to detail. The rear-wheel drive Ioniq 5s produce 225 horsepower, 258 pound-feet of torque, and that's enough to get the Ioniq 5 up to 60 miles an hour in about 7.4 seconds. All-wheel drive is quite expensive, but it is much more powerful. You get 320 horsepower and 446 pound-feet of torque, and that's enough to get the Ioniq 5 to 60 miles an hour in about 4.5 seconds. Although that's pretty quick, this is not the quickest accelerating electric SUV out there. There are definitely competitors that will accelerate faster and also be more sporty in handling. People who have driven the Ioniq 5 say that it is more on the cushy side. From that perspective, the all-wheel drive has plenty of power. Now check this out. This thing is something you can plug into the Ioniq 5's charge port, and what comes out? 120 volt electricity. So you can use the Ioniq 5 to power other devices. Hyundai calls this feature vehicle to load, and they want to be extra cool. So instead of 2 as in TO, it's the number 2. So it's V2L. And I think it's a little silly to make such a big fuss out of this thing because, like I pointed out in my Kia Niro EV video from about a month ago, this technology has been available to us for decades. It's called an inverter, and you can buy one for under $100 on Amazon or AutoZone, O'Reilly, whatever. You can plug the inverter into your cigarette lighter outlet in your normal car, and then you can plug your 110, 120 volt devices into the inverter itself. Because there's the bigger battery capacity, you can plug in something larger like this electric bicycle. It's kind of like chargeception, right? You've got this big electric vehicle charging like a smaller electric vehicle. The only thing that's missing from this is a little RC car or like a hoverboard plugged into the bicycle. Under the hood, we have this small compartment for electric cables and charging accessories. Taking a look at the interior here, it's very clean, very modern, very fresh. Everything is based on rectangles with rounded edges. It's very much like iPhones, or just like, I guess, smartphones and tablets in general, right? Where you have a rectangle with rounded edges. Obviously, what dominates the interior design up front is this panel with two screens on it. They are both 12¼ inches diagonally, and really the difference is just that this is a touch screen on the right and this is a non-touch screen on the left, because you don't really need to poke at your instrument cluster. And on the steering wheel here, we have 4 dots. Now, what is that? Well, as it turns out, that's actually Morse code for the letter H. For Hyundai. Hyundai really thought about every little design element in this thing. And here we take a look at the front seats, and you can see they're very plush looking, not sporty looking at all. Whoa, the center console thing just moved forward. You can see that it actually slides up and back. And this reminds me a lot of those minivans from the 80s and the early 90s, where the interior bits were actually sort of reconfigurable, where seats could swivel and move around and things like that. The Ioniq 5 really does take inspiration from products that were on the market about 30, 40 years ago, and this is yet another example. And here we have a better view of the sliding center console. Who drinks water out of bottles like this? I certainly have not. Maybe I'm just not bougie enough. And down below we have 2 USB charging ports and a Qi wireless charging pad. Now, I like the fact that the charging pad is down here. In other words, it's out of sight for the driver as the driver is driving. And in this picture, we can see that there's also a space for something the size and rough shape of a purse. This is also very thoughtful. I mean, car designs are often built around men and the way that men use cars and the size of an average male. And it's very rare, it's very uncommon for vehicles to be built around women as well. Literally, every time I get into my mom's car when I'm visiting, she's got her purse on the passenger seat, and we have to move it, and then we put it on top of the center console, and then it like falls back into the back seat. It's a mess. But the Ioniq 5 has a specific place for something like a purse. Maybe even a small gym bag, right? This is a very thoughtful little storage bin here. And notice that up here we have yet another USB port as well as a 12-volt outlet. So in this zone alone, we have 3 USB ports, a Qi wireless charging pad, and a 12-volt outlet. That is a lot of charging options. And in yet another nod to those minivans of the 80s, this front footwell area is open for like an open, airy feel, but I think for safety, I'd actually rather have a bump right here in between the 2 footwells. Because if, let's say, a water bottle rolls down here, and if you take a turn, the water bottle could roll over here and then interfere with your pedals. And so I actually prefer to have a bump there, but hey, that's a design decision they made to keep everything open and airy. Here we have a picture of the infotainment screen showing some range information, and it says here Iberdrola. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'll just assume that's how you say it. So I Googled that, and it turns out it's a Spanish electric utility. And the first thing that pops up when you Google that is this. His Majesty the King inaugurates Iberdrola's green hydrogen plant in Puerto Llano. That is the most European thing I have read in my entire life. Anyway, this screen is very similar to the analogous screen in the Niro EV, but I think it has a much more, in my opinion, attractive color scheme and better fonts. It just looks more modern, more fresh. I really like the white and the green and the blue. The Ioniq 5 can come with 360-degree cameras, and in order to render this image here, it needs to have a pretty good amount of GPU power. That's actually quite impressive for a mainstream brand to provide that kind of GPU power. Personally, I don't need these fancy options, but what I do like is a very snappy, very responsive infotainment experience. And so hopefully the GPU system, with all that power, can produce a very snappy experience. Really looking forward to driving one of these Ioniq 5s and finding out for myself. Here you can see these little pixelated boxes here, and I love that these 4 are just hanging out by themselves. It's so intentional, and so there's a certain art to it that I really appreciate. The back seats are also pretty standard, but if you look closely, what you'll notice is that there's this little switch right here. And what that means is, hey, check this out. The seats can actually move forward and back. Later on, we'll see the front and the rear seats, and you can see just how much legroom there is. So that's very cool. And of course, you have the lever to fold down the seats for extra cargo capacity. This is a 60-40 split. As you can see from the trunk angle, very, very utilitarian, very, very practical. And up front, next to the instrument cluster, we have this little magnetic board where you can like stick little magnets or photos and whatnot. And I looked online to learn more about this thing, and people online were like, "Ooh, so lame, why would you want that? Like, who would post things on there?" But there are a lot of families that do like to have little photos of their kids and whatnot, and you can see right here, that's literally what they're showing you is possible here. And to me, this magnetic board is yet another reason that I think that the Ioniq 5 is for people who have young families. And so we're talking about like kind of late Gen Xers or early millennials who are at that age range now where they need a slightly bigger vehicle for a family. And guess what? That's the demographic that grew up in the 80s and early 90s with all of those like pixelated digital toys and things, as well as those minivans, right? So there's so many details of the Ioniq 5 that really harken back to a time when the target demographic was young, and now this like magnetic board is a feature for those same people now that those people have kids. In this modern era where the world is very fast-paced, very stressful, mental health issues are everywhere, I really do think that having a little reminder of what's important in life, like let's say pictures of your kids or your pets or your loved ones, whatever it is, having that right in front of you in your car is a great way to just bring things down a little bit when you are stuck in traffic and you're like stressed out and whatnot. It's actually a really positive thing. So, I applaud Hyundai for paying attention to these little details and providing us with these little touches in the Ioniq 5. And notice up here we have this little opening here for the HUD, the heads-up display. That's very nice. Here we can see that the two front seats go way back, right? They can lean back for you to take a nice nap. If I had seats like this back in the day when I used to work in an office, man, nobody would see me from 1 to 3 p.m. every day, I'll tell you that. The way this works is that if you press this button right here twice, the seat will recline back to that relaxation position, and this little support right here for your lower leg pops up as well. Hey, startup idea, guys. We could start a mobile dentistry service run out of an Ioniq 5. And in fact, back here, there's like a 120 volt outlet, so you can run all your like dental tools. So yeah, investors, call me. Seriously though, why do I think there's such an emphasis on sleeping in the Ioniq 5? Well, there's a big question as to what do you do when your EV is charging on a road trip? Tesla has answered this question with Netflix and games. Hyundai, in my opinion, has come up with the better answer. Get some sleep. Here's a stat for you guys. In 1940, Americans slept an average of 8 hours per night. Today, we sleep 6.5 on average. That is a disaster waiting to happen. So yes, Teslas are more entertaining as you're charging your vehicle on a road trip, but I think Hyundai's got the right idea here, and that is that sleep is something we all could use a little bit more of, and that is especially true if you're on a long road trip and you're on the road for long hours. And now that she's had a nice nap, she's awake and ready to go. This picture is whack. I mean, look at his seating position. He's like way too far back. He actually has to lean his back forward in order to comfortably hold the wheel. And look at the way he's holding his mug. I don't think that's coffee in there. But now he's in the passenger seat and he's letting his creativity soar. And in this picture, she has finished her nap and she's ready to do some work. And you can see that her laptop is plugged into this 120 volt outlet here. Marketing is often not about saying literal information. It's often about creating a feeling. And the set of pictures really creates a feeling of relaxation, creativity, openness. So that sums up our tour of the press photos of the Ioniq 5. So who is the Ioniq 5 really designed for? Building off of what I was saying earlier, I think the Ioniq 5 was designed for certain Gen Xers and millennials who maybe have a small family, and they probably also want something that's cooler and more edgy than a minivan, and perhaps with a splash of nostalgia from the 80s and early 90s when they were growing up. Even though the Ioniq 5 is designed to be this like mass market vehicle, that does not mean that Hyundai just slapped something together and shoved it out the door to make a few bucks. They actually sweated all the little details. They made something that they could be proud proud of. And as a car guy, I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you for sticking with me until the end of this video. If you made it this far, if you could do me a favor and hit that like button, that really helps out my little growing channel. And if you're not subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe. I come out with videos roughly every week, so you don't want to miss any of that. Thanks again for watching. My name is James, and I will see you in the next video.